Lewis Kane sat in his cramped office cubicle, a bland, impersonal space that mirrored the monotony of his daily routine. Around him, the hum of the office life buzzed like a persistent background noise, keyboards clicking, papers shuffling, and colleagues chattering about everything from weekend plans to last night's TV shows. He paid none of it any attention. The people around him were little more than passing figures, their laughter and casual banter washing over him like meaningless static. Lewis kept his head down, his focus firmly fixed on the spreadsheet glowing on his computer screen. Row after row of numbers demanded his attention, and he gave it willingly, immersing himself in the quiet logic they offered. It was in these numbers, in their predictability and order, that he found solace. His sharp, clever mind worked quickly, dissecting data and solving problems with an efficiency that had earned him a reputation for being one of the most reliable employees in the department. But that was where his reputation ended. He wasn't known for engaging in team lunches or going out for the light-hearted banter at the water cooler. Lewis Crane was not a man who sought connection. Words, in his view, were an economy most people squandered. Why waste effort on conversations destined to evaporate into the void of unremarkable memories? For him, the office was a place for work, not relationships. And so, as others forged bonds over shared jokes and stories, Lewis remained an enigma, present, but deliberately apart. Once the workday drew to a close, Lewis embarked on his usual solitary commute home, a routine so ingrained it felt like a second job. He moved through the office's bustling exit like a ghost, unnoticed and uninterested in the goodbyes exchanged around him. At the station he joined the throng of commuters boarding the crowded tube. The air was thick with the muted chaos of the city, muffled conversations, the screech of train wheels, and the occasional impatient sigh. Lewis kept his eyes trained on the floor, a silent participant in the moving sea of humanity. He manoeuvred through the packed carriage space with practiced ease, slipping into a corner where he could make himself as small as possible. It was a strategy, a defense mechanism, to avoid brushing shoulders or meeting the gaze of a stranger, anything that might invite unwelcome interaction. When the train reached his stop, he stepped off without hesitation, already folding himself into the next phase of his routine. The street stretched ahead of him, dimly lit and familiar, offering nothing but the comfort of predictability. With his head down and his shoulders hunched, he walked the short distance home, purposefully avoiding the eyes of anyone who passed. Even a fleeting glance felt like a risk, a crack in the carefully constructed shell he lived within. It was the same every evening, a journey as quiet and unremarkable as the man himself. When Lewis finally reached his small, cluttered flat, he closed the door behind him with a quiet sigh of relief. The outside world, with its noise and demands, was firmly shut out. Here, within these four walls, he could entirely be himself, hidden, undisturbed, and insulated from the people he worked so hard to avoid. The flat was a reflection of its owner, unkempt but functional, filled with the kind of disorder that only made sense to him. Without a second thought, he flicked on the TV, its faint blue light casting flickering shadows across the room. The monotonous hum of the evening news filled the space, a companion that demanded nothing from him. This was his sanctuary, a place where time passed without obligation, where he didn't need to explain or perform for anyone. The only break in his solitude came from Tom, his neighbour from the flat above. Tom was an occasional visitor, and Lewis found him tolerable in a way he found few others. Tom was much like him, quiet, withdrawn, and equally disenchanted with the world at large, but he had a more contented outlook on life. The two would often have deeply engaging conversations. Lewis had a relationship with him that he had with few others. Better to be alone, Tom would always remark, leaning back on the chair opposite Lewis, than surrounded by idiots. Lewis would nod in quiet agreement, finding a rare sense of understanding in those words. Tom never pried into his life, never asked probing questions or made unnecessary demands. He was content to sit in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing a thought or two before leaving Lewis to his solitude. Whether they were speaking or silently enjoying each other's company, Lewis genuinely enjoyed his company. It wasn't a friendship in the conventional sense, but it was enough. Tom was the only person in the world with whom Lewis felt a faint, unspoken kinship, a reminder that even in his solitude, he wasn't entirely alone. One evening as they sat in Lewis's dimly lit flat, the murmur of the TV providing a faint background hum, Tom leaned back in his chair with an ease that contrasted sharply with Lewis's perpetual tension. The room was heavy with the quiet that always surrounded their visits, but tonight there was something different in Tom's demeanour, a peculiar glint in his eyes that hinted at an unspoken thought brewing just beneath the surface. "You know," Tom said suddenly, his voice casual but edged with mischief, "it's easier to enjoy your own company when you've got a few tricks up your sleeve." Lewis glanced at him, his expression sceptical. He paused, weighing whether or not to humour the comment. Finally he asked, "What tricks?" Tom didn't respond immediately. Instead he tilted his head slightly back. His lips curving into a faint knowing smile. Without breaking eye contact, he extended a hand toward the cluttered coffee table. For a moment nothing happened, and Lewis's brow furrowed. Then, without warning, the remote lying on the table lifted into the air, hovering a few inches above its surface as if suspended by invisible strings. Lewis stared, his disbelief palpable. His usual measured composure shattered as his eyes widened, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, words failed him completely. Tom chuckled softly, clearly enjoying the reaction. "It's easy when you know how," he said. His tone was as unbothered as if he'd just explained how to brew a cup of tea. The remote drifted gently back to the table with a soft thud, leaving Lewis staring at it as though it might spring back to life again. In that instant, the fragile normalcy of Lewis's carefully constructed world shifted, leaving behind a faint ripple of something unfamiliar. Curiosity. Lewis stared at Tom, his mind racing to process what he'd just witnessed. The logical part of him clawed for an explanation, a trick of the light, a cleverly concealed wire. But the gnawing instinct deep within him whispered otherwise. This wasn't a trick, this was not normal. His eyes darted from the floating remote, now innocently resting on the table, to Tom's face. There he found nothing but an unsettling gleam of dark amusement. Before Lewis could speak, Tom reached into his pocket, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He withdrew a small glass vial, its surface catching the dim light. Inside were 2 pills, glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly luminescence, their unnatural light casting soft shadows on Tom's fingers as he held them up. He gave the vial a slight shake, the pills clinking together like tiny bells in the oppressive silence. "Here," Tom said casually, extending the vial towards Lewis. His tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge to it, a weight that made the room feel smaller. "Try one," he said. Lewis didn't move at first. His eyes flickered between the pills and Tom's face, searching for some indication of a joke or reassurance. Instead he found only that smirk, calm, confident, and unnervingly detached. A flicker of fear passed through Lewis, quick but sharp, as his pulse quickened. "What if I die?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a question laden with both skepticism and genuine terror. He wanted to believe this was all some elaborate ruse, but he couldn't ignore the chill creeping up his spine. "Isn't this a matter of life or death?" Tom shrugged as if the answer didn't particularly matter to him either way. The smirk widened slightly, amusement tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All the best drugs are," he said, with a light chuckle, holding the vial out just a little closer. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what Lewis would do. Instead of swallowing the pills, Tom held the vial up to the light and cracked one open with a quick, deliberate motion. What happened next defied anything Lewis could have ever anticipated. In an instant, both pills erupted into a thick, swirling cloud of luminescent smoke. The vapour moved unnaturally, alive with a pulsating glow that painted the walls with strange, dancing shadows. It churned and twisted in its mesmerising patterns, filling the room with a surreal, otherworldly light. "Breathe in," Tom said, his voice low and commanding as he leaned closer, his intense gaze locking onto Lewis's. There was no hint of hesitation in Tom's demeanour. No explanation, no reassurance, only a certainty that brooked no argument. Lewis hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to stop, to push the swirling fog away, to question everything. Yet the smoke seemed to have a mind of its own. It coiled and pulsed hypnotically, as if reaching out for him, drawing him closer despite himself. The air around him vibrated with an energy he could not quite describe. He found his resistance slipping away. Finally, almost against his will, Lewis took a deep breath. The dense, electric fog rushed into his lungs, filling him with an intense, almost overwhelming sensation. It wasn't like air, this was heavier, charged, alive. In an instant his body responded. An electrifying surge of energy coursed through him, sharp and exhilarating, as though someone had flipped a switch and flooded his very being with raw power. The sensation was intoxicating, a jolt that ripped through a dull, muted existence he had grown so accustomed to. For the first time in years, Lewis felt fully awake, as if the world around him had been drained of colour and sound until this very moment. He gasped, his eyes widening, and stared at Tom, who watched him with a knowing smirk, waiting to see what would happen next. Tom's eyes gleamed with approval as he watched Lewis inhale the glowing smoke. "Good," he said softly, with his voice calm but charged with expectation. "Now concentrate on the cup." Lewis's head was still spinning from the rush of energy surging through him. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned his gaze to the cup sitting on the table, its plainness mocking him in the surreal glow of the smoke-filled room. He narrowed his eyes, willing himself to focus. At first there was nothing but the stillness of the room and his own ragged breath, but then the cup wobbled, almost imperceptibly at first, its base scraping softly against the table. It tilted side to side, quivering under the force of Lewis's burgeoning concentration, before sliding an inch across the surface. It was small, almost insignificant, but to Lewis it felt monumental. His heart raced, adrenaline and exhilaration flooding his system as he stared at the cup, unable to look away. For the first time in his life he felt a flicker of true control, a power that was his alone. Tom nodded slowly, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Not bad," he remarked, his tone deceptively casual. "Now let's see how far you can go." The hours slipped by, the strange glow of the smoke fading into the dimness of night as Lewis practiced under Tom's watchful eye. With each attempt he grew bolder, the objects on the table moving with increasing speed and force. He could nudge them, spin them, even send them crashing to the floor. Every success brought an urge of satisfaction that fed something deep inside him, something dark and long dormant. It was the fire of years of simmering rage and resentment, a smouldering ember now roaring into life. Days passed, and Lewis practiced obsessively in the solitude of his cluttered flat. The thrill of control consumed him, each success pushing him further, faster into his newfound abilities. His powers grew sharper, more precise, and with that growth came a hunger, an insatiable desire to see how far he could take them. Moving objects was no longer enough. He wanted to push boundaries, to test the limits of what he could do. And as his confidence grew, so did his ambition. The resentment that had stewed inside him for years began to twist into something more dangerous, a craving for vindication, for retribution. He thought of the faces that had dismissed him, the voices that had ignored him, the endless parade of people who treated him as insignificant. With each memory, his resolve hardened. It wasn't long before Lewis's gaze turned outward, to the streets below where the bustling city pulsed with life. He was ready to step out of the shadows, ready to show the world exactly what it had overlooked, ready to make them pay. A few days later, the opportunity Lewis had been unconsciously waiting for finally presented itself. It happened at the office, the place he had grown to loathe with every fibre of his being. A sterile hive of monotony and petty social hierarchies. The moment came as he stood by the exit, and noticed, as always, his sharp eyes watching him from the shadows. Ed. The name alone was enough to set his teeth on edge. Ed, the smug, self-assured colleague who had humiliated him in front of the entire office just weeks ago, reducing him to little more than a punchline. The memory burned fresh in Lewis's mind, a wound that had festered in silence ever since. As he watched Ed stroll out of the building, with his usual air of arrogance, Lewis's hands clenched into fists at his side. He knew Ed's type well. Single, self-centered, the kind of person who builds a fortress of bravado around an empty life. No partner, no close friends, no one who had wondered too much if he had suddenly disappeared. That thought sent a dark chill coursing through Lewis, his pulse quickening as his mind raced ahead. He stepped out into the cool evening air. Following Ed at a distance, he moved carefully, blending into the flow of pedestrians as the city's lights flickered above them. The streets were slick with rain, their reflective surfaces shimmering like pools of liquid light. Lewis kept his head down, his heart pounding in time with the dull thud of his shoes on the pavement. The air was heavy with anticipation. The weight of what was coming was almost suffocating. Ed walked briskly, oblivious to the figure trailing him. The crowd thinned as they moved deeper into the city, the noise of bustling streets fading to a quiet hum. Lewis's focus sharpened, his senses attuned to every detail. The splash of Ed's shoes in a puddle, the faint glow of a street lamp casting shadows against wet brick walls. When they reached a quieter, more desolate part of the street, Lewis slowed his steps. There was no one around now, no curious bystanders to interrupt what he had planned. The air felt colder here, the silence more oppressive. Lewis inhaled deeply, steadying his nerves. He had been waiting for this moment, whether he had admitted it to himself or not. This was his chance, his moment. Lewis stopped abruptly, his breath shallow as he stared intently at Ed's back. The night seemed to grow quieter, the city's distant hum fading into the background as he channeled every ounce of his rage, every scrap of its newfound power. He focused, narrowing his vision until all that existed was Ed, arrogant, oblivious, and directly in his line of fire. Without so much as lifting a finger, Lewis pushed, a silent command laced with the anger he had carried for years. The effect was immediate and brutal. Ed's body jerked forward as if struck by an invisible force, and staggered directly into the path of an oncoming car. Collision was thunderous, the sickening crunch of metal meeting flesh reverberating down the empty street. For a moment time seemed to freeze, as Ed's lifeless form crumpled into the ground, unmoving under the pale glow of a flickering street lamp. For a moment there was silence, thick, oppressive, the kind of silence that grips the air after something irreversible has occurred. Then came the panicked cries of the driver, a mix of shock and terror as they scrambled out of the vehicle, but Lewis remained hidden in the shadows, his expression cold, his lips curling into a grim smile. Satisfaction washed over him in a dark, intoxicating wave. This was it, the beginning of a new chapter, a life finally on his terms. Lewis's descent into darkness begins the moment he shoves Ed in front of a speeding car. As Ed's lifeless body lies in the street, Lewis seizes the opportunity to assume a new identity. He acts quickly, snatching Ed's wallet, phone, and personal effects from his corpse. To cover his tracks, he meticulously wipes any fingerprints and other physical evidence, using his psychic powers to eliminate any lingering psychic traces that might link him to the scene. But Lewis knows that physical possessions are not enough to fully become Ed. To truly assume his identity, Lewis cloaks himself in a psychological disguise. With his psychic abilities, he crafts a subtle aura that convinces others he is Ed. This is not a literal transformation, but rather a manipulation of perception, altering how people see his face, voice, and mannerisms. When others interact with him, they perceive him as Ed. No questions asked. With the stolen keys in hand, Lewis heads to Ed's apartment. Once inside, he begins the meticulous process for erasing any evidence of his previous life. He discards photos, clothes, and personal mementos, using his ability to alter any documents, photograph, or correspondence that might raise suspicions. In every conceivable way, he becomes Ed. Lewis's next challenge was a bold one, to step into Ed's life as if it had always been his own. The very next morning, armed with the confidence that his powers afforded him, Lewis walked into Ed's workplace. He had spent the night meticulously studying Ed's mannerisms, the cocky stride, the effortless smirk, the cadence of his speech. Now he imitated them with unsettling precision, his every movement a calculated performance. The office was abuzz with its usual morning chatter when he arrived. Lewis pushed the door open with a kind of casual authority Ed had always exuded, nodding at a few passing faces as if they were beneath his notice. His heart hammered in his chest, but outwardly he maintained a calm, composed demeanour. At first the reactions from Ed's colleagues were subtle but unmistakable. A raised eyebrow here, a lingering glance there, small signs that they sensed something was not quite right. There was an indefinable difference about Ed, something beyond their grasp. Conversations faltered briefly when he joined, a flicker of uncertainty passing through the room before resuming. Ed felt the pressure mounting, but didn't falter. Instead, he let his psychic abilities guide him. He reached out with his mind, weaving a subtle web of influence around those closest to him. Their doubts softened as he nudged their perceptions, smoothing over the inconsistencies they couldn't consciously name. Slowly, their wariness gave way to a tentative acceptance, their minds reshaping memories and impressions to align with what they thought they knew. Days turned into weeks, and Lewis grew more adept at maintaining the facade. He perfected Ed's confident charm, his quick comebacks, even his slightly condescending laugh. By the time a month had passed, the cracks in his performance had all but vanished. To his co-workers he was Ed, a familiar presence who fit seamlessly into their world. Lewis had pulled it off. With his psychic powers and relentless determination, he had successfully claimed Ed's identity. Yet as he settled deeper into the role, a question loomed in the back of his mind. How long could he maintain this illusion, and what price would he pay for stealing another man's life? Lewis then focuses on gaining access to Ed's digital life. Using Ed's phone and laptop, he hacks into the social media accounts, bank accounts and emails. He reads through old conversations, learning about Ed's friends, past relationships and routines, ensuring he can seamlessly slip into Ed's life without arousing suspicion. To cover his tracks, Lewis deletes or alters incriminating messages that might hint at Ed's knowledge of his presence. Now fully entrenched in Ed's identity, Lewis found himself swept into a life he had only ever observed from the periphery. For the first time he was at the centre of it all, a man greeted with warmth and familiarity by strangers, a figure who commanded respect with nothing more than a nod or a smile. His colleagues now sought him out, engaging in light-hearted conversations over a coffee. Invitations to social events flooded his inbox, each one a tangible reminder of the stark contrast to the previous life of isolation and obscurity. It was intoxicating. Every interaction, every moment of acknowledgement was a high he had never known before. Lewis revelled in it, drinking in the attention and admiration like a man starved. The sting of his old life, the humiliations, the loneliness, faded into a distant memory, replaced by the thrill of this new existence. But it wasn't the social perks that captivated him. The more time Lewis spent as Ed, the more he became addicted to the power he wielded. The power to rewrite reality itself. With his psychic abilities, he began to manipulate those around him in ways he had never dared before. It started small, nudging a colleague to forget a missed deadline or make an acquaintance feel a little closer to Ed than they really were. But the thrill of control quickly led him down darker paths. Lewis discovered he could do more than smooth over doubts or nudge perceptions. He could create entirely false memories. With each success, his confidence grew. He began inserting shared experiences into the mind of Ed's closest friends and colleagues, fabricating moments of camaraderie or acts of kindness that had never occurred. It became a twisted game, one he played with increasing skill. "Remember that trip we took last year?" he'd say with a smirk. Watching the light of false recognition spark in their eyes, they'd nod eagerly, laughing at all the details he'd planted in their minds as if it were their own. The ease with which he could reshape their realities thrilled him. Lewis wasn't just imitating Ed anymore, he was reinventing him, moulding his relationships to suit his own desires. Each false memory he created, each lie he embedded in the minds of others, reinforced his sense of control. He was no longer the overlooked, forgotten man he had been. He was Ed, respected, admired, indispensable. And as the lines between Ed and Lewis blurred, so too did the boundaries of morality and consequence in his mind. As time passes, the cracks in Lewis's carefully crafted facade begin to show. Initially it's just a gnawing sense of paranoia. He catches glimpses of Ed in reflective surfaces or feels an icy touch on his shoulder when no one is there. Soon he starts hearing Ed's voice in whispers, accusing him, reminding him that he can never escape what he's done. Lewis's powers, once a source of strength, start to turn against him. The aura that once helped him deceive others becomes harder to maintain. Friends and colleagues start giving him strange looks, as if for a split second they can see through his illusion. Whispers about something wrong with Ed begin to circulate at the office. Lewis's grip on his stolen life began to slip. No matter how desperately he tried to hold on, the once effortless illusion that made him appear as Ed, now fraying at the edges, demanding more and more of its focus to maintain. The psychic aura he had relied on to cloak himself in Ed's identity no longer worked automatically. It required intense concentration just to keep up with this facade. At first the changes were subtle. A colleague would glance at him with a flicker of uncertainty, their brows furrowing slightly as if they were trying to reconcile two conflicting images. Someone might pause mid-conversation, their tone hesitant, their eyes lingering on his face a second too long. It was as if beneath the confident exterior he had so carefully crafted, they could sense someone else entirely, someone who didn't belong. Those moments of doubt became more frequent, and with each one Lewis felt his control slipping further. He began second-guessing himself, obsessing over every detail, every gesture. Was his laugh too forced? Did he misremember a story Ed had told? Did his tone betray hesitation that Ed would never have shown? The strain of constantly projecting an identity that wasn't his own gnawed at him, and the cracks in his performance only widened. The effort to maintain the illusion was becoming unbearable. Every morning as he stepped into Ed's workplace, he had to steel himself for the day ahead, summoning every ounce of his psychic power to ensure that no one saw through him. But this was draining, like trying to hold up a crumbling wall while the weight of the world bore down on him. And then came the paranoia. Ed couldn't shake the feeling that his colleagues were whispering about him behind his back, their conversations halting when he walked into the room. He imagined their eyes on him, scrutinizing every move, every word. At night, alone in Ed's apartment, the silence became deafening, filled with the imagined murmurs of suspicion creeping ever closer. He found himself questioning everything. Could they tell something was off? Did they know he wasn't really Ed? Or was his mind simply unravelling under the weight of his deception? Either way, the life he had stolen, the life that had once felt like a triumph, was slipping through his fingers. And as his powers faltered, so too did the foundations of the world he had built around them. The more Lewis pushed his powers to their limits, the more reality began to unravel. At first the changes were fleeting, easy to dismiss, a faint shadow in the corner of his vision, the sensation of being watched when there was no one there. But soon the hallucinations became more vivid, more relentless, as if the cracks in his mind were widening and spilling over into the world around him. Every time he looked into a reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even the sheen of his morning coffee, Ed's dead eyes stared back at him. They were cold and unblinking, his lifeless face etched with the same expression he'd worn in those final moments on the street. The visions would linger, holding his gaze longer than any illusion should, and no matter how hard Lewis blinked or turned away, they stayed burned into his mind. At night the paranoia reached its peak. He would wake suddenly, his heart pounding, drenched in sweat but unable to shake the eerie sensation of cold breath on the back of his neck. The air around him felt oppressive, heavy, with a presence he couldn't see but was certain existed. There were times he swore he heard whispers, faint indecipherable words, carried on a breeze that shouldn't have been there. Then came the worst of it. One night, jolted from sleep by an unshakable sense of dread, Lewis opened his eyes to find himself paralysed with fear. His room was cloaked in darkness, but he knew he wasn't alone. The air felt charged. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, as his eyes adjusted to the faint light spilling in from the window. Standing at the foot of the bed, he saw a silhouette, indistinct yet unmistakably human. He froze, unable to move, unable to look away, his pulse roaring in his ears. The figure didn't speak or move, but its presence was suffocating, the weight of his gaze pinning him in place. When he finally summoned the courage to sit up and turn on the lamp, the room was empty, but the sensation lingered, the icy certainty that someone or something had been watching him. The hallucinations began to bleed into his waking hours, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred, and Lewis found himself spiralling. It wasn't just guilt or paranoia anymore. It was as if the essence of Ed's existence was clawing its way back, refusing to let Lewis forget the life he had taken and the power he had abused. Lewis's powers spiraled beyond his control, slipping from his grasp like a runaway train. At first it was subtle, small, almost imperceptible changes in Ed's apartment. The lights would flicker when he entered a room, a glass would slide a few inches across the counter without him touching it. He dismissed it as a side effect of his growing powers, an overflow of psychic energy. But it didn't stop there. Furniture began to shift of its own accord, scraping across the floor in the dead of the night. The television turned itself on and off, the static crackling with an eerie resonance that sent shivers down his spine. The phone buzzed uncontrollably, notifications blinking from blank screens. Even the air in the apartment felt heavy, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were pushing it back against his presence. At first Lewis tried to suppress it, focusing his mind to regain control, but the disturbances only grew worse. It dawned upon him that this wasn't just his powers running rampant. There was something deeper, more malevolent at play. The apartment seemed to recognize him for what he truly was, an intruder, a thief who didn't belong. The once safe haven of Ed's life turned against him, and for the first time since stealing it, Lewis felt utterly powerless. Lewis's descent into madness took a darker turn as his mind began conjuring grotesque apparitions of people from his past. Familiar faces, once he thought he had long forgotten. They appeared unbidden, their eyes hollow and filled with silent accusation. At first he saw them in fleeting moments, a shadowy figure lingering at the edge of his vision, or a reflection in a passing window that didn't match the person standing there. But soon the apparitions grew bolder, invading his stolen life. He could see them at Ed's workplace, standing amongst his colleagues, watching him with unspoken judgment. They appeared at social gatherings, blending seamlessly into the crowd, their presence unsettling and impossible to ignore. These phantoms were people he had wronged or despised in his old life, co-workers he had slighted, acquaintances he had ignored, even strangers whose faces he could barely recall, twisted into malformed demonic faces. Lewis couldn't determine if they were real or figments of his deteriorating mind. Were they manifestations of guilt? Or had his tamperings with reality torn open something he could no longer control? Their silent and wavering stares were unbearable, eroding his sanity and pushing him further into paranoia. Everywhere he turned he felt their presence, an inescapable reminder of the man he truly was. Meanwhile, a strange burn mark appeared on Lewis's hand. A strange tattoo, left from the ritual with Ed. It grows darker and more painful, spreading like a twisted root. Each time he uses his powers, the mark throbs as if punishing him. In a fit of desperation, he tries to cut it out, only to watch in horror as the wound heals almost instantly. The mark now blacker and more grotesque. Lewis's unravelling mind reached a horrifying new depth when he began experiencing blackouts, entire hours and even days vanishing from his memory. He would wake up in unfamiliar places, surrounded by strangers who greeted him as Ed, their smiles unnerving in their familiarity. Each time he felt a deeper disconnect from himself, as though he were no longer in control of his own actions, just a puppet, helpless against the dark will of his powers. The worst of these blackouts came when he woke up on the cold floor of Ed's apartment, his clothes stained with blood. His hands trembled as he looked down, horrified to find crimson streaks dried across his palms. Panic surged through him. What had he done? He stumbled to his feet, his mind racing, and began searching for answers. A trail of blood led him to the bathroom. His heart pounded as he pushed open the door, his reflection coming into view in the cracked mirror. But it wasn't his own face staring back at him. The glass shimmered with an image of Tom, but not the Tom he remembered. He was a twisted, demonic version of him, his bleeding eyes blazing with red malice. Lewis staggered back, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room spun, his mind reeling. The boundaries between his past, present, and the terrifying unknown had collapsed entirely, and the person or thing that pulled the strings was no longer just in his mind. Desperate for answers, Lewis turns his psychic powers inward, delving deep into the labyrinth of his mind in search of the truth. What he uncovers is far worse than anything he could have imagined. The abilities he took from Ed are not just powers, they are a parasitic force, a malignant presence that has been growing inside him from the moment of the ritual. The transfer wasn't clean. Along with the abilities, a fragment of Ed's consciousness had also taken root. The horrifying reality begins to unravel. Every time Lewis used these powers, he was feeding Ed's spirit, strengthening its grip. The blackouts, the hallucinations, the feeling of constantly being watched, it was all Ed, clawing his way back into his life. What Lewis mistook for his own loss of control was actually Ed's consciousness growing stronger, feeding off Lewis's cruelty and anger until it could assert itself completely. As the truth crashes over him, Lewis realizes that the ritual wasn't a gift. It was a trap, a way for Ed to cheat death and reclaim control. Lewis had been nothing more than a vessel, a temporary shell for Ed to inhabit until he could resurface. In a climactic confrontation, Lewis finds himself battling not just his own spiralling mind, but Ed's growing presence within him. The signs had always been there, the flickering aura, the shifting faces in the mirror, the blood-soaked eyes. Ed had been lying in wait, manipulating him, slowly eroding his sense of self until there was nothing left to fight back. With every ounce of focus he can muster, Lewis tries to push Ed out, to reclaim control over his body and mind. But the harder he fights, the more he feels Ed's laughter, his presence surging through him like a tide that cannot be stopped. The powers he once craved become a prison, and Ed's revenge is almost complete. In a final devastating twist, the strange mark on Lewis's arm ignites with searing, unbearable pain. He collapses on the floor, his body convulsing as the fiery sensation spreads through him like an unstoppable wave. He claws at his arm, gasping, but it's no use. The pain is more than physical. It's as if the very soul of his being is being torn apart. As the agony peaks, Lewis feels his consciousness slipping away, pulled deep into the recesses of his own mind. His vision blurs, and when he tries to move, he can't. He's trapped, a powerless observer in his own body. From the depths of his mind, he watches in helpless horror as Ed's presence fully takes over. Lewis's body rises, but it's no longer him in control. Ed's spirit, now triumphant, takes command, his cold, calculating smile twisting across Lewis's face. With terrifying ease, Ed resumes his life, leaving Lewis stranded in the shadows of his own mind, a silent witness to his own defeat. Now fully in control of Lewis's body, Ed wastes no time leveraging the psychic powers to his advantage. With chilling precision, he erases all traces of his former existence, systematically dismantling any clues that could tie him to the man he once was. Bank records, social media profiles, even memories in the mind of those who knew him. Ed manipulates it all, reshaping the world to forget the person he used to be. To everyone around him, Lewis Crane is now just another face in the crowd, indistinguishable from the millions of others navigating the city. As Ed moves through the world with a confidence Lewis never possessed, he seems untethered, free from the constraints of the cursed existence he endured before his death. Every action is calculated, his every word a tool to manipulate or dominate those around him. What terrifies Lewis most, though, is Ed's growing mastery of his psychic powers, which now extend far beyond what Lewis had ever achieved. With each passing day, Ed becomes more unstoppable, a force of destruction wearing Lewis's face. Meanwhile, Lewis is imprisoned deep within his own mind, trapped in a void of silence and helplessness. He watches powerless as Ed uses his body to commit unspeakable acts. He cannot scream, he cannot fight, he cannot even flinch as Ed's hands carry out the deeds he could never have imagined. Every moment is a torment, as if Lewis's very identity is being erased, overwritten by the dark will of a man who now inhabits him. Lewis is no longer just a prisoner. He is a ghost haunting his own life, a silent, tortured witness to his body being used as a weapon for Ed's revenge on the world.